I was 29 years old when I decided to spend a week alone in an old hunting cabin outside of Gallup, New Mexico. It was the summer of 2012, and I had been working long shifts in construction back in Albuquerque. My mind felt burnt out. My body was sore all the time, and I kept telling myself I needed space away from noise, deadlines, and the constant heat bouncing off pavement. A friend of mine had told me about a small, run-down cabin that belonged to his uncle, tucked away in the woods near the reservation line. The man hadn't used it in years. He said if I wanted a quiet place, I could take it for free. The cabin wasn't much. It stood about 200 yards off a dirt road that looked more like a dry creek bed than anything meant for vehicles. I had to park my old Ford at a wide turn in the road and walk the rest of the way with my duffel bag over my shoulder. The cabin itself was one story, small and weathered badly. The wood was sun-bleached and gray. The porch sagged slightly to the right, and one of the shutters clung by a single rusted hinge. When I stepped inside, the air smelled like dry dust and old wood. There was no electricity, just a small wood stove in the corner, a creaky bed frame with a thin mattress, and shelves lined with canned goods that must have been left years ago. The place felt empty but safe enough. I swept out the worst of the dust with a broom that was leaning in the corner and opened the single back window to let air move through. My plan was simple. Hike in the mornings, sit out on the porch with a book in the afternoons, and let my head clear. The first couple of days went exactly like that. The nights were different though. The quiet there wasn't like the city. It was heavy, pressing, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The only sounds I could hear were crickets, wind scraping across dry grass, and sometimes a coyote calling far away. The stillness made me feel exposed, like I was being watched. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my nerves. On the third night, I woke up around 2 in the morning. The cabin was hot and still, the air outside thick. I sat up on the edge of the bed, poured a little water from my jug into a tin cup, and I heard it, something moving outside. At first it was faint, just dry twigs snapping. I thought it might be a deer, or maybe a coyote nosing close to the cabin. But then I heard the sound of footsteps, not the quick light tread of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps, crunching gravel around the side of the porch. I froze. My first thought was that maybe someone from town had wandered up here, but the cabin was so far out I couldn't understand why anyone would. I sat there in the dark, holding my breath, listening. The steps stopped. For a long stretch, there was nothing. Then I heard the wooden porch creak. Every instinct told me not to move, not to make a sound. The bed groaned faintly under my weight as I leaned forward, trying to look toward the door. The latch was shut, but I could see the thin sliver of light through the frame, and something shifted across it, casting a faint shadow. The sound stopped as suddenly as it started. Minutes dragged by. I forced myself to lie back down, my heart still hammering, and eventually I must have dozed off because I woke to sunlight coming in through the window. The next morning I checked around the cabin. The dirt around the porch showed footprints, but they were strange. They looked like bare feet, but the toes were long, stretched oddly forward, and dug deeper than a normal person's would. I tried to convince myself it was just erosion in the soil making them look off, but I couldn't shake the unease. That night I barely slept. I kept the lantern lit until it burned low. Around the same time as before, just after 2, I heard the sound again. This time it was closer, slower, circling the cabin. Gravel shifting, branches cracking, a dragging sound like something brushing against the walls. My skin crawled. I sat up with the hunting knife I kept beside the bed, gripping it so tight my knuckles hurt. The steps circled twice, then stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I stared at the door until my eyes blurred. After what felt like hours, I got up enough courage to peek through the back window. At first, I saw nothing but the dark outline of trees. Then, between 2 pines, I saw it. It looked like a man, but wrong. The limbs were too long, the way it stood too stiff. The head tilted slightly, as if it were listening. Even from that distance, I could see its skin looked stretched, thin and tight like dried leather. Its body was naked but without detail, like something unfinished. I ducked back, heart slamming in my chest. I didn't look again. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bag. I told myself I'd had enough and would leave. But when I walked out to where I had left my truck, I found the windshield smashed. Glass glittered across the dirt. The hood bore long scrapes, deep enough that metal curled back. My tires had been slashed clean through. Panic set in then. I was 15 miles from the highway, no cell service, and the only road out was too far to walk in the heat of the day without water. I decided to stay until nightfall, then start walking under the cover of dark when it was cooler. Those last hours in the cabin were the longest of my life. As night fell, I sat in the corner of the room with the knife across my lap. My lantern flickered. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind. I jumped. Around midnight, I heard it again, but this time it didn't stay outside. A scraping sound came from the back wall, like nails dragging slowly across wood. Then the back window rattled. I bolted up and shoved the bed frame against the door, my chest heaving. The scratching moved, circling until it reached the front steps. The porch groaned under heavy weight. I pressed myself against the far wall, knife shaking in my hand, sweat dripping down my face. The door latch shivered as if something was testing it. Then silence. I stayed frozen for hours. I don't know when I drifted off, but when I opened my eyes again, daylight filled the room. I shoved the bed frame aside and bolted out, not even looking back. I walked until my legs ached, until my throat felt raw and dry, until I reached the highway. A passing pickup finally stopped, and the man inside gave me a ride back toward town. When I told him what happened, he just stared at me, then shook his head and said I shouldn't have stayed out there alone. He didn't ask for details, and I didn't give any. I never went back for the truck. I left it to rot in the dirt. It's been years since that week, but even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can hear those slow, steady footsteps outside my door. I don't know what I saw out there, and I don't try to give it a name anymore. What I do know is this. I had never been so certain in my life that something was watching me, something that wanted me gone, and something that wasn't fully human. I tell myself it was just exhaustion, heat, or my imagination twisting shadows into shapes. But deep down, when I think about those stretched footprints in the dirt and the sound of fingernails dragging across the wood, I know it was real, and I know I was lucky to walk away. I had always liked exploring back roads and forgotten places. That was how I ended up at the cabin in the first place. It was late summer of 2014. I had just turned 27, and I was driving alone through a rural stretch of northern Pennsylvania. The two-lane road wound through endless woods, the kind of place where you could drive for miles without seeing another car. I wasn't in a rush to get anywhere, just wandering, trying to clear my head after a bad week. That's when I saw it. A narrow dirt trail cutting off from the main road, half hidden by tall weeds and broken branches. The path looked like it hadn't been used in years, but something about it pulled at me. I slowed down, glanced around to see if anyone was nearby, then turned the wheel and bumped my way onto it. My car struggled over the uneven ground, mud splattering up against the tires. The trail stretched deeper into the trees, curving until the highway behind me was completely gone. After about half a mile, the brush opened up into a small clearing, and that's when I saw the cabin. It was old, the kind of place that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. The wood was gray and warped, the roof sagging in the middle, and one of the shutters dangled loose, creaking whenever the wind moved. The grass around it was waist-high, and I noticed an old rusted barrel half buried in the dirt near the front steps. Everything about the place screamed forgotten. I killed the engine and just sat there for a moment, staring at it. The longer I looked, the heavier the silence felt, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I got out, the air warm and sticky with humidity. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked toward the steps. Up close, the cabin smelled of rot and damp wood. The front door was slightly open, pushed inward by time or weather. I hesitated before touching it, my hand hovering near the splintered edge. Part of me thought I should leave it alone, but curiosity won. I pushed the door open wider, and it groaned loudly. Inside was stale air and shadows. Dust floated in the thin beams of sunlight that leaked through the cracks in the walls. The living room was bare except for a broken chair, a table missing one leg, and piles of leaves that had blown in over the years. The floorboards creaked under my weight. I stepped carefully, afraid one might give out. The kitchen was to the right. An old cast-iron stove stood against the wall, rusted and streaked. A few empty jars were lined up on a shelf, their glass cloudy with dirt. The cabinets were open, doors hanging crooked. A large hole in the wall near the sink looked like something had clawed or smashed through it, and I caught the faint smell of mold coming from the dark interior. I shivered, even though the heat pressed heavy outside. I wandered into what must have been a bedroom. The bed frame was still there, though the mattress had collapsed in on itself, springs poking out at odd angles. On the floor lay scraps of fabric, maybe old clothing, maybe bedding, hard to tell anymore. I crouched down and picked up a piece. It crumbled to dust between my fingers. As I moved further inside, I noticed something strange. The windows were boarded from the inside. Not all of them, but enough to make me uneasy. Whoever had lived there hadn't just left. They'd shut themselves in. I tried to push that thought away, but it kept circling back. Why would someone seal themselves in this place? The back room was darker than the rest. The boards across the window barely let in any light. I switched on the flashlight on my phone and scanned the space. Against the wall sat an old trunk. The leather was cracked, the metal latches rusted shut. It looked heavy, like it hadn't been moved in years. My heart beat faster as I touched it. The latches resisted but finally gave with a snap. Inside were scattered papers, notebooks, and what looked like personal belongings. A pair of boots sat at the bottom, worn thin. There was also a rolled-up sleeping bag, stiff and stained with age. The papers were water-damaged, the writing smeared, but I could make out fragments. Lists of supplies, dates, and short sentences that looked more like notes than a diary. The last entry I could read clearly was dated November 1989. Something about that made me pause. The handwriting grew shakier near the end. Lines scratched out, words harder to read. One page mentioned hearing them outside again, and another about not sleeping tonight. I couldn't tell if it was paranoia, hunters, or something else, but I felt the hair on my neck rise. I closed the trunk quickly, my chest tight. The silence in the cabin pressed in harder now, heavier, as if it didn't want me there. I stood up, brushing dirt off my jeans, and decided it was time to leave. But as I turned toward the door, I froze. On the floor near the doorway was something I hadn't noticed before. A set of footprints in the dust. They weren't mine. They were older, softer, but clear enough to follow. They led from the doorway to the trunk and back again. My stomach dropped. Someone else had been there, and not that long ago. Suddenly, the cabin felt alive in the worst way, like eyes were on me, though I saw no one. My ears strained for sound, but all I could hear was the faint drip of water somewhere in the back. I forced myself to move quickly, stepping over the boards and back into the main room. My heart pounded as I pushed through the doorway and into the open air. Outside, the woods seemed darker than when I arrived. I hurried to my car, every step making me feel more exposed. I yanked the door open and slid inside, locking it immediately even though it felt silly. My hands shook as I started the engine. The sound of it roared too loud in the quiet clearing. I backed up fast, tires spitting gravel, and turned onto the dirt path. The drive back to the main road felt endless. Every branch that scraped against the car made me flinch. When I finally saw the highway again, relief washed over me so strong I almost laughed. I pulled onto the pavement and didn't look back until I was several miles down the road. But the image of those footprints stayed with me. They hadn't been fresh, but they also hadn't been decades old. Someone had been there, going through that trunk, standing in the same room I had. Whoever it was, they might still be using that cabin, maybe watching from the woods while I poked around inside. I never went back. I didn't tell anyone about it either, because I knew how it would sound. Like I was imagining things, letting my mind run wild in a creepy place. But I know what I saw, and I know the feeling I had when I realized I wasn't the only one who'd been in that cabin. Even now, years later, whenever I drive through back roads or pass an abandoned building, I think of that day. I remember the silence, the boarded windows, the papers in the trunk, and most of all, the footprints in the dust. They were proof that someone else was out there, living or hiding in that forgotten place. And the thought that I might have walked in on them without even knowing, that thought still unsettles me more than anything. It was late autumn in 2016 when I decided to spend a few days in a small wooden cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I had driven out from Grand Rapids with my dog, a big brown Labrador named Rusty. He was 5 years old then, strong and restless, the kind of dog who never sat still for long. The cabin was about 4 miles from the nearest paved road, hidden off a dirt track that wound through dense forest. I had been looking for solitude, a break from city noise, and the cabin seemed perfect when I booked it. By the time I arrived, it was close to dusk. The road had turned rough and narrow the last mile, tree branches scraping against my truck as I crept along. When I finally parked in front of the cabin, I felt a strange kind of silence pressing down. No traffic, no people, not even the faint hum of a distant farm. Just the sharp air and the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. Rusty leapt from the truck and immediately started sniffing along the porch. The cabin itself was small, built decades ago, I guessed, with dark wooden walls and a tin roof that was already spotted with rust. The front porch sagged slightly, and the steps creaked under my weight. Inside, it smelled of old pine and smoke, the scent of a place that had been shut for months. There was one main room with a fireplace, a narrow kitchen tucked in the corner, and a tiny bedroom at the back with just enough space for a bed and dresser. The place was basic but clean, and it felt like it could hold together for the week I planned to stay. After unloading the truck, I started a fire in the fireplace. The nights in October up here dropped cold quickly, and the warmth of the flames filled the room. Rusty settled near the fire, his chest rising and falling as he dozed, but every few minutes his ears flicked at sounds outside. At first I thought nothing of it, just deer moving through the trees, maybe squirrels or raccoons, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed how still the forest seemed. No crickets, no owls, no distant howls of coyotes, just the pop of the fire. That first night, I lay in bed with Rusty at my feet. The air smelled damp, and the wind pushed against the walls. Around midnight, Rusty raised his head and growled low in his throat. I sat up, listening hard. First, I heard nothing. Then came the sound of something stepping through leaves just outside the cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps. My stomach tightened. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed and clicked it on, the beam catching the wooden walls. Rusty barked once, sharp and loud. The steps stopped. I stayed still for a long time, waiting, my ears straining. The only thing I heard after that was the wind moving branches against the cabin. Eventually, I lay back down, though sleep came in fragments. Every time I started to drift off, Rusty shifted and growled again. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was damp from a light rain during the night, and sure enough, there were prints in the mud near the porch. They weren't boot prints exactly. They were larger, heavier, like someone in thick-soled work boots had stood there for a while. The trail led from the trees to the porch, then back into the woods. My chest tightened as I followed them for about 30 yards, but they disappeared among the leaves and brush. I told myself it could have been a hunter passing through, someone lost maybe. Still, it didn't sit right with me. I spent most of the day splitting the wood pile stacked against the cabin wall, trying to keep busy. Rusty stayed close, never wandering far the way he usually did. His nose was always in the air, ears pricked. Every so often he would give a short bark toward the treeline, then go quiet again. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened with heavy clouds. Rain started just after sunset, a steady downpour that turned the roof into a drum. I lit lanterns and cooked a small meal on the old propane stove. Rusty paced more than usual, moving from window to door, his claws clicking on the wooden floor. The storm drowned out most outside sounds, but a few times I thought I caught the faint crack of branches breaking under weight. Each time, I set down what I was doing and listened, my pulse jumping. That night was worse than the first. Around 1 in the morning, Rusty's barking jolted me upright. He was at the front door, teeth bared, fur bristling. The rain was still pounding, but beneath it I heard something, metal scraping on wood. My stomach sank as I realized it was the front doorknob turning slowly, like someone was trying it. I grabbed the axe I had leaned against the wall earlier and stood there in the dark, heart slamming in my chest. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Rusty lunged at the door, barking and snarling. After what felt like a minute but was probably only a few seconds, the noise stopped. Just the rain again. My hands were shaking so bad I could hardly hold the axe. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in a chair by the door with Rusty at my side, both of us listening. At dawn, I stepped outside to check. The rain had left the ground soft, and right there in the mud were clear boot prints. They led right up to the porch again, then back into the woods. The prints were deep, heavier than mine, like the person had been standing there a long time. My chest felt tight, and every sound in the woods put me on edge. I thought about leaving, but part of me didn't want to run. I had brought supplies for the week, and I told myself maybe it was just someone messing around. A drunk hunter, some local who knew the cabin was rented. Still, I started keeping the axe closer and the truck keys in my pocket at all times. The third night came, and I barely let the fire die down. The woods were silent again, and Rusty never relaxed. Around midnight, I heard it. Slow steps on the porch boards, heavy enough to make them creak. Rusty exploded in barks, throwing his weight against the door. My whole body shook as I stood there, holding the axe in both hands. The knob turned again, harder this time, twisting back and forth. I yelled out, my voice raw, though the storm outside swallowed the sound. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence. Rusty barked into the air for a long time before finally quieting. I didn't open the door. I didn't even move until the gray light of morning. When I finally looked outside, the prints were back. This time they circled the cabin, around and around like whoever it was had been walking the perimeter while I sat awake inside. My hands were cold, even though the sun was up. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. I packed everything fast, barely caring how I stuffed it into the truck bed. Rusty jumped in without hesitation, still tense and alert. As I drove down the narrow dirt track, my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. The trees closed in behind me, and I swore I saw movement along the edge of the woods, a figure slipping between the trunks, keeping pace for a short while before vanishing. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the cabin nothing but a memory in the trees. My chest loosened only when I saw the first gas station an hour later. Rusty was still standing in the back seat, staring out the window, ears forward. I never went back to that cabin. I never even called the rental office to ask about it. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time the house creaked at night, every time Rusty barked at nothing, I felt that same cold weight in my chest. Even now, years later, I can still picture those deep boot prints circling the cabin. Someone was out there, night after night, testing the doors, waiting for something. And the scariest part wasn't that they came. It was that I never found out why. It was late September of 1997 when I found myself assigned to one of the smaller ranger stations deep inside Bitter Pine National Park in northern Montana. I was 26 at the time, new to the job and eager to prove myself. The cabin they gave me wasn't much, just a one-room structure with rough wood walls, a single cot, a narrow table, a wood stove in the corner, and a small storage shed out back. It was built back in the 1950s, meant for seasonal use, but the place hadn't been updated much since. The park itself stretched for miles, thick with old pine and spruce trees, with steep hillsides and long valleys that seemed to swallow sound. In the daytime, it was beautiful. Open skies, mountain ridges catching the light, the smell of pine needles and wet soil everywhere. At night, though, it was a different world. The trees pressed in closer, shadows stretched across the ground, and even the small sounds carried in strange ways. That September, storms had been rolling in and out for weeks. Heavy rain followed by long nights of wind that rattled every loose board on the cabin. The days were filled with long hikes to check trails, picking up litter, looking for signs of campfires or lost hikers. Most of the time, it was quiet work. I'd see an elk herd now and then, or a black bear cutting through the brush, but people rarely made it out that far. It was late in the season and visitors were thinning out. I remember one afternoon coming back from a hike up the ridge, my boots soaked from walking through wet underbrush, the sky already darkening, and thinking how isolated the place felt. The road to the cabin was barely a dirt track, and when the rain hit, it was more mud than road. I knew if my truck broke down out there, I'd be stranded for a while. That thought didn't bother me much at first. I liked the quiet, but then one evening, after I had cooked a simple dinner on the propane stove, canned beans and some bread I had bought in town, I noticed something that unsettled me. Near the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards from the cabin, the brush looked pressed down, as if something heavy had passed through. It wasn't unusual to see animal tracks, but this was wide and messy, not like deer or elk. It looked more like a man had been stomping through with no care for the branches snapping underfoot. I brushed it off at the time. Maybe a bear, I told myself, or just the storm winds pushing down the thinner brush. Still, I made a note of it in my logbook. That night, the storm rolled in. Rain hit the tin roof so hard I couldn't hear much else. The wind pushed against the windows, and at one point I thought I saw the outline of something move near the storage shed, but the rain made everything blur. I stayed inside, fed more wood to the stove, and tried to sleep. The next morning, the ground outside was soft and slick, and I saw the marks more clearly. Footprints, human. They led from the woods to the shed and then back into the trees. I stood there in the wet grass staring at them, feeling my stomach tighten. The nearest town was almost 20 miles away. Nobody had business being out here, not in the middle of the night, not during a storm like that. I opened the shed to check if anything was missing. Inside were just tools, a rusted axe, some gas for the generator, and a few boxes of supplies. Nothing looked disturbed, but the air inside felt damp, like the door had been opened and left for a while. I spent the day on edge, checking over the area. I hiked down the trail about half a mile, thinking maybe I'd find more signs, but the rain had washed most of it away. Still, I couldn't shake the image of someone walking around the cabin while I slept inside. I kept the rifle the Park Service issued leaning against the wall near my cot that night, something I hadn't bothered to do before. Over the next 3 days, the same thing kept happening. I'd find fresh footprints, sometimes circling wide around the cabin, sometimes closer, always human, always leading back into the trees. Whoever it was, they never came during the day. Only at night, when the storm covered their steps, when the woods were too dark to see clearly. Each morning I woke to find signs that someone had been there. On the 4th night, the rain stopped. The air was cold and still, the forest quiet in that way that made every small sound feel sharp. I kept the lantern low, not wanting to shine too much light out the window, and I sat at the table listening. Around midnight, I heard it, the slow crunch of footsteps on the wet ground. Not an animal. The weight was different, more careful. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, heart pounding, straining to hear. The steps moved around the cabin, deliberate, circling. At one point, something brushed against the wooden wall, a faint scrape of fabric or a hand sliding across. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I opened the door and found clear prints in the mud, circling in full loops around the cabin. Some came within just a few feet of the walls. My hands shook as I wrote it all down in the logbook. It was one thing to find prints near the shed. It was another to know someone had been standing right outside while I sat there in the dark. By then, I knew I couldn't ignore it. The radio at the cabin was old, but it still worked. I called in to the ranger station miles away and reported what I'd seen. They told me they'd send someone out in the next couple of days, but the storms had made the roads rough, and it could take time. That left me alone out there, waiting. That night was the worst. The air was colder, frost starting to form on the edges of the windows. I sat with the rifle in my lap, every muscle tense, listening. Hours passed. Then, just past 1 in the morning, I heard the sound again. Footsteps, heavier this time, not trying to be quiet. Whoever it was walked straight to the front door. I heard the boards creak on the small porch. Then silence. I held my breath, gripping the rifle, staring at the door. Minutes stretched out, the only sound the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then came the rattle of the door handle. Slow, deliberate, testing it. Shook once, twice, then stopped. I aimed the rifle at the door, waiting for it to burst open, but nothing happened. After a long while, I heard the steps retreat, fading back into the trees. When daylight came, I opened the door and saw clear boot prints on the porch. Not worn boots like a hiker's, but heavy ones, wide tread, maybe work boots. They led down the steps, across the grass, and disappeared into the woods. I followed them for about 50 yards before losing the trail in the thick underbrush. That was enough. I went back, packed what I could carry, locked the shed, and waited near the truck until the other rangers arrived later that afternoon. They never found anyone. They searched the woods for days, but the forest was too wide, the trails too many. No campsites turned up, no sign of where the person had been staying. Just those footprints, circling a cabin where I had been sleeping alone night after night. When I finally left that station, driving back down the muddy road with the other rangers, I felt the tension drain out of me in a way I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I never did another solo assignment that deep in the park again. And even now, years later, I still think about those footsteps in the dark, circling closer each night, stopping just outside the door. Whoever was out there never showed themselves, never spoke a word, but they made sure I knew I wasn't alone. That was enough to scare me more than anything else could. Because it wasn't some story, wasn't some ghost tale, it was real. Someone was out there watching, and for those nights, the only thing between us was a thin wooden wall. I was 35 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin in northern Montana. It was 1997, early fall, the air already sharp with the kind of cold that seeped into your skin even when the sun was still out. I had rented the cabin from a retired logger named Ray, who lived a few miles away down a dirt road. He gave me a brief warning about the area, wildlife, bad weather, isolation, and then left me with a set of heavy brass keys and a map that showed the nearest ranger station. The cabin was plain, a squat box of weathered timber that sat back from a clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. There was a front porch with a warped railing and steps that gave under my weight when I climbed them. Inside, it smelled of old wood, damp stone from the fireplace, and something metallic that reminded me of rust. The furniture was sparse. A single bed with a wool blanket, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and shelves stacked with canned goods someone must have left behind years ago. I told myself I came here for the peace, to escape noise and people. My job in the city had been grinding me down, long hours staring at screens and breathing recycled air. I thought being alone in the woods would recharge me. But even as I unpacked my bag, I noticed how quiet the place was. Too quiet. The silence was thick, and it felt like the trees outside were pressing against the walls, watching. The first 2 days were uneventful. I chopped wood, boiled water, and hiked short trails around the area. At night, the cabin was dark except for the lantern I set on the table. The forest came alive then, filled with cracks and snaps, the rustle of branches, and sometimes the high-pitched screech of an animal I couldn't place. My nerves tightened when I lay in bed listening. I told myself it was just foxes or raccoons, maybe a deer nosing through the clearing. On the 3rd night, I was outside splitting logs when I noticed something strange about the tree line. The woods looked darker than usual, and the space between the trunks seemed to swallow the last bit of daylight. I stood there holding the axe, staring into the shadows. I could swear I saw movement, not the twitch of a squirrel or a bird, but a slow shifting, like someone taking a step and then stopping. I waited, my chest tightening, but after a minute nothing came out. I went back inside and locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do before. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something outside. Light steps across the porch, the creak of the railing, a faint tap against the wall. At one point, the dog from a nearby property, Ray's I assumed, started barking in the distance. The sound carried through the trees, sharp and frantic, and then cut off too suddenly. The silence afterward was worse than the barking. The next morning, I found boot prints near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. I had been careful where I walked, and these led from the woods up to the wall, circling the cabin, and then back into the brush. The prints were large, maybe a man's, and fresh in the damp soil. My stomach dropped when I saw them. I felt exposed, standing there in the clearing with no neighbors for miles. I spent the day restless, checking the windows, listening for any sound that didn't belong. I kept the axe inside with me. The map Ray had given me showed the ranger station about 12 miles away, but I didn't have a truck. I had planned to hike back at the end of the week when he came to check in. I thought about leaving early, but the idea of walking those miles alone with someone possibly following me felt worse. That night, the noise came again. Around midnight, I heard the creak of the porch boards. It was slow, deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, gripping the axe so tight my hands shook. I waited, holding my breath, staring at the outline of the door in the dim lantern light. Then came the sound of metal scraping lightly against the wood, like someone dragging a knife or a piece of wire along the wall. My skin crawled. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I opened the door just enough to look out. The railing had fresh scratches along it, long, shallow cuts in the wood. My mouth went dry. Whoever it was hadn't just walked by. They had lingered. By the 5th day, I was running on fumes. I barely ate, too sick with fear to keep food down. I thought I saw someone again in the woods that afternoon, standing between two pines. When I blinked, they were gone. Could have been my imagination, but the prints outside and the scratches on the porch were real. I started barricading the door with the table and chairs every night, though I knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined to get in. The sixth night was the worst. The noises began earlier, before midnight. First, the crunch of leaves outside, then the soft thud of steps on the porch. The lantern flickered, shadows jumping across the walls. I pressed myself into the corner, clutching the axe. Then came a slow rattle at the door handle. Turned once, twice, but the lock held. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. The person didn't force it. Instead, they stayed there. I could hear their breathing faintly through the wood, steady and calm, like they had all the time in the world. Hours passed before the sound stopped. I sat awake until the first weak light of morning seeped through the window. When I finally pushed the table aside and opened the door, I found a cigarette but crushed into the porch boards right by the doorframe. I didn't smoke, and neither had Ray when I met him. That small piece of trash was more terrifying than anything else so far. It meant they had been close enough to stand there, smoking, while I sat just feet away inside. I didn't wait anymore. I packed my bag in under 5 minutes, stuffed some water bottles in, and left. I didn't care if it took me all day. I was walking the 12 miles to the ranger station. My legs shook as I forced them to move, and every few minutes I glanced back, certain I'd see someone trailing me through the trees. The walk felt endless. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of a branch, made me spin around. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps matching mine, but when I stopped, the forest went still. I kept going, faster than I thought I could. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto the gravel road that led to the ranger station. When I reached the building, a wave of relief nearly knocked me over. I pounded on the door until a ranger opened it. My words came out in broken gasps, but I managed to explain what happened. They drove me back to town that evening. Later, the ranger told me they checked the cabin. More footprints were found around the property, circling again and again. Whoever it was had been watching me for days, maybe the entire week. But they never found the person. No name, no face, just signs that someone had been there, waiting. I never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, the memory of those nights presses on me. It wasn't ghosts, it wasn't anything out of a storybook. It was worse because it was real. Someone out there in the woods watching me breathe, watching me sleep, waiting for the right moment that, by luck, never came. The farm cabin sat on the edge of the property, an old structure that had been built long before I was even born. It wasn't where I usually stayed, but that year in 1994, after my uncle passed, I had agreed to take care of the place for a while. He'd left the land to my cousin, but she was living in the city and didn't care much for rural life. I was 32 then, still strong enough to handle farm work, and I thought staying in that cabin would give me some peace. I didn't expect much, just a roof, for walls and space to breathe away from town. The cabin wasn't much. It had a low ceiling, wood paneling stained dark from years of smoke and oil lamps, and a stone fireplace that barely kept the place warm. The front porch was sagging, and the steps creaked under my boots every time I went out in the morning. Around it stretched the farmland, wheat fields to the north, a patch of woods to the east, and rolling hills that made you feel like the world just kept going forever. There were no close neighbors, and the nearest road was a dirt track that could swallow your truck tires after a good rain. The first few nights were quiet. I got used to the routine, fixing fences, checking the barns, walking the property. I brought my supplies, stacked firewood, and told myself it was just me and the land. But after a while, I started noticing things that didn't sit right. It wasn't anything you could point at straight away. It was more like a feeling at first. I'd be working near the tree line and catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping deeper into the woods. But when I looked, there was nothing. Sometimes I'd find boot tracks near the barn, pressed deep in the mud, and I knew they weren't mine. They were wider, heavier, like someone else had been out there. One night, a week into my stay, I heard the first noise. It was just past midnight. I was sitting on the narrow bed in the cabin, trying to read by lantern light, when I heard the crunch of footsteps outside on the gravel path. Slow, heavy steps moving close to the porch. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, but when I checked outside, there was nothing. Just the empty night and the wind moving through the wheat. I told myself it might have been an animal, maybe a deer wandering too close. But in the morning, I checked and saw the prints again. Boots, a man's. That made me more cautious. I started locking the cabin door with the old iron latch, though I doubted it would stop anyone who really wanted to come in. At night, I set a chair under the doorknob too, just in case. Out there, if someone wanted trouble, no one would hear you yell. Days passed, and the unease grew heavier. I'd be out in the fields and feel like someone was standing just beyond sight, watching. My dog, Rex, who'd always been steady, started acting different too. He'd stiffen at night, staring toward the woods, growling low in his throat. Sometimes he'd bark like hell, but when I went to check, the yard was empty. His instincts were better than mine, and if he was uneasy, I knew I had a reason to be. One late evening, I was repairing a broken section of fence near the woods when I noticed something hanging from one of the posts. It was a strip of cloth, torn and weathered, tied there tight. I hadn't put it there, and I knew no one else should have been around. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, dirty and stiff, maybe blood on it. I pulled it off and stuffed it in my pocket, feeling that prickle on the back of my neck again, that sense of eyes following me. The nights after that were worse. I'd lie in bed listening to the sounds outside, the crunch of dirt, the creak of wood on the porch, even the soft scrape of fingernails against the window frame one night. Rex growled so long and deep that his throat was raw the next morning. I hardly slept, just lay there staring into the dark. The night it came to a head was colder than usual. I remember because I could see my breath inside the cabin. The fire had burned down low, and I was too uneasy to go to sleep. I sat in the chair by the window watching out over the yard. Around 2 a.m, Rex lifted his head and let out a sharp bark, then pressed himself against the door, teeth bared. My heart was pounding, and then I saw him. There was a man standing at the edge of the field, just past the first row of wheat. His body was still, but his head tilted slightly, watching the cabin. He wasn't holding a lantern or flashlight, just standing there in the dark like he'd been waiting. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline of broad shoulders and a hat. He didn't move for a long time, and neither did I. Finally, he stepped forward, slow and steady. I didn't have a gun, only an axe I kept by the door for chopping wood, so I grabbed it and held it tight. My hands were slick with sweat, but I told myself I'd swing if I had to. Rex barked like mad, lunging against the door. The man stopped near the porch steps. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the wheat without a sound. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I kept the axe beside me, every nerve on edge. By morning, I walked the yard and found the prints again. Fresh ones, leading from the woods straight to the porch and back. He hadn't been a trick of the dark. He was real. Someone had been watching me, coming closer each night. I packed that morning. I didn't care about finishing the repairs or keeping the cabin warm. I loaded my truck with what I'd brought, called Rex into the cab, and drove out down the dirt road, looking over my shoulder the whole way. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never stayed in that cabin again. I told my cousin I wouldn't watch the place anymore, and she eventually sold the land. I don't know who the man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was a squatter, maybe worse. All I knew was that he had been watching, waiting, and the longer I stayed, the closer he got. Even now, when I think back to that farm, I can still picture him standing there in the night, just outside the field, waiting. And I'm glad I left when I did, because something told me if I'd stayed one more night, he wouldn't have stopped at the porch. I was 28 years old when I found myself driving up the broken mountain road that led to my grandmother's old cabin. It was the fall of 1997, and the air already carried the sharp cold that crawled into your bones long before the real winter arrived. The road was narrow, uneven, the kind where the gravel shifted under the tires and every bend seemed to threaten a slip over the edge. I hadn't been to the cabin in years, not since I was a teenager. My grandmother had lived there most of her life, even after my grandfather died, even after her children, including my mother, moved away. She was stubborn and private, the type of woman who didn't ask for help unless it was absolutely necessary. When she stopped answering phone calls, we figured it was just her being herself again, retreating from the world like she always did. But when weeks passed without a letter, without her showing up in town to pick up groceries or medicine, my mother told me to drive up and check. I didn't argue. Someone had to do it, and deep down I already knew what I was going to find. The last few miles to the cabin were worse than I remembered. The road narrowed, trees pressed close on both sides, their branches arching above me, dark and heavy. Dead leaves swirled in the air, and the light faded fast behind the clouds. By the time I reached the small clearing, the cabin stood like a shadow among the trees, half swallowed by the overgrowth. The place looked abandoned. The roof sagged in the middle, patches of moss and rot spread across the wood, and the windows looked dark, coated with grime. The yard was overrun with weeds, fallen branches, and damp leaves. My stomach knotted when I pulled up beside the porch. The door was shut, but the frame was warped, as if it had been beaten by years of wind and weather without care. I stepped onto the porch. The boards groaned under my weight. The silence pressed in. No birds, no wind, just the faint ticking of the cooling car engine behind me. I knocked once on the door, out of habit, but the sound echoed back at me like I had disturbed something I shouldn't have. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, a thick, sour stench that clawed down my throat and made me gag. It was the smell of something long dead, trapped inside. I pulled my shirt over my mouth and stepped inside, forcing myself not to turn back. The cabin was dim, dust floating in the stale air. The curtains were drawn tight, and only thin cracks of gray daylight slipped through. The furniture was exactly where I remembered it. An old rocking chair by the fireplace, the short wooden table, the shelves with books my grandmother had never gotten rid of. Everything looked the same, only buried under dust and decay. And then I saw her. She was slumped in the armchair by the cold fireplace, her body tilted to one side, her hands resting limp in her lap. Her skin was gray, sunken, her face frozen in a way that made her look both peaceful and horrifying. Her eyes were closed. Her hair, once tied back neat, hung loose and tangled. She had been there for weeks, maybe longer. I could see the dark stains on her clothes, the way the air swirled with the smell of rot. My knees almost gave out. I stumbled back a step, holding onto the wall to steady myself. I knew she was gone before I even touched her, but I reached out anyway, brushing the back of her hand with my fingertips. Her skin was cold, leathery. I pulled back quick. I didn't know what to do at first. The phone lines didn't run this far up anymore, and even if they did, I doubted the old phone in the kitchen would work. My cell had no signal this deep in the hills. I'd have to drive back down, find the sheriff, bring them up here. But the thought of leaving her like that, alone in the chair, made my stomach turn worse than the smell. I walked through the cabin. The floors creaked under my boots. In the kitchen, dishes were piled up in the sink, coated with mold. A half-empty glass of water sat on the counter, thick with dust. A loaf of bread had hardened into a black block of mold. It looked like she had just stopped in the middle of living. In her bedroom, the bed was unmade. Clothes were thrown across the chair, a stack of newspapers on the nightstand. On top of the pile was a calendar, the last date marked nearly 2 months ago. No notes, just an X in red ink. The longer I stayed, the worse it felt. The smell clung to me, the silence pressed in, and the thought of her body sitting in that chair ate at me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that I was being watched, though I knew I wasn't. It was just the way death changed a place, how it left a mark heavier than anything alive ever could. I went back into the living room. I stared at her again, my grandmother who had been strong and stubborn her whole life, now just a shell collapsing into the chair. I wanted to cover her, to move her, but the idea of lifting her body made me sick. So I found an old blanket in the bedroom, shook the dust off, and draped it gently over her. It didn't hide the shape of her completely, but it felt like the least I could do. The daylight outside was slipping fast, turning the windows into dull mirrors. I knew I couldn't stay there overnight. The idea of sitting in that cabin, with her body only a few feet away, in the dark, with the smell growing stronger by the hour, was too much. I needed to leave to get someone who could handle this. But when I stepped outside, the air didn't feel like a relief. The woods pressed close, dark and heavy, the trees groaning under the wind. My car sat at the edge of the clearing, but the road back looked narrower, meaner, now that night was settling in. I hesitated, thinking about the drive down, the gravel, the steep drop-offs. If I tried it in the dark, I could end up off the road, stuck or worse. I looked back at the cabin, its windows staring out at me like black eyes. I realized I had no choice. I'd have to stay just until morning, then drive down in daylight. Inside, I lit one of the old kerosene lamps I found on the shelf. The light flickered, weak but enough to push back the shadows. I sat at the kitchen table, the blanket pulled over my shoulders, and tried not to think about what was just in the next room. The silence made every sound louder. The wind outside, the tick of the lamp, the creak of the roof. I barely slept. Every time my eyes shut, I'd see her face again, the gray skin, the way her head tilted forward like she had been waiting for someone to find her. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, the boards groaning, but when I gripped the lamp and looked, no one was there. Maybe it was just the wood shifting. Maybe. By morning, the fog had settled thick in the trees, but I didn't care. I got into the car, started the engine, and drove down that broken road without looking back. I went straight to the sheriff's office. My words tumbled out too fast, shaky, but they understood. They followed me back later that day, and I stayed behind in town, waiting. Hours passed. When they finally came back, one of them told me she had likely passed quietly. Natural causes, nothing violent. They said it like it was supposed to comfort me, but comfort didn't come. I drove home that night with the smell still clinging to my clothes. The image burned into my head. My grandmother, alone in that cabin for weeks, maybe calling out for someone who never came. The silence swallowing her up long before I ever found her. I still see it when I close my eyes, the cabin, the chair, the shape under the blanket. And the thought that I was too late, far too late, never leaves me. The rain had been falling all afternoon, heavy drops that rattled against the hood of my jacket as I dragged the last bundle of firewood up the muddy slope. It was the spring of 1997, and I had come out to the woods of northern Vermont with the idea of putting up a small cabin. I had no crew, no neighbors nearby, and no real plan other than some sketches folded up in my backpack and a strong desire to be away from people for a while. The property was a piece of cheap land I'd bought the year before, about 20 acres of thick forest cut through by an old logging road. There wasn't much around besides pine, wet earth, and silence. I had spent the day stacking the wood and cutting posts for the frame, my hands raw from the saw handle, my jeans damp from the wet ground. By the time the evening came, the sky had turned black and the rain picked up, steady and cold. I was soaked to the skin. My temporary shelter was just a stretched tarp between two trees with a ground sheet underneath. I had planned to build something better, even just 4 walls and a roof, but the storm had rushed in quicker than I expected. I had no choice but to crawl under the tarp and wait it out. The sound of rain in the forest is strange at night. It doesn't fall evenly. It slaps against the leaves above, then drips and bursts, sometimes pounding so hard on the tarp that it sounds like gravel being poured on sheet metal. Every few minutes, a gust of wind would shake the trees and bring down a heavier shower. I lay there in the damp air, staring up at the sagging fabric above me, and tried not to think about how far away the nearest road was. The logging path I had driven up had already turned into soft mud. I doubted my old pickup could make it back down without sliding into a ditch. After an hour of lying there, my stomach growled. I had brought a small cooler with sandwiches, but eating in the damp didn't feel right. I chewed on a piece of bread anyway and listened to the woods. The thing about the forest at night, especially when it's raining, is that sound carries in odd ways. A branch breaking 100 yards off can feel like it's happening right beside you. More than once, I froze thinking I heard footsteps, the sharp crack of twigs under weight. I told myself it was just deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I found myself gripping the small hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag. I tried to focus on the work I had done earlier, replaying the steps in my head. I had managed to dig 4 holes for the foundation posts and set 2 of them in place, bracing them with scrap wood so they stood upright. The cabin was supposed to be only a 12 by 12 structure, nothing big, but enough to keep dry and warm with a stove. I pictured what it would look like once the frame was up, how the roof would slope, where the small window would go. These thoughts kept me distracted, though not for long. Around midnight, the tarp started to sag in the middle from the weight of water. I got up, pulled on my wet boots, and used a stick to push the pooled rain off the surface. The water dumped down in a rush, splashing over my arms. I cursed under my breath, then crouched back under the shelter. That's when I noticed it again, the sound of movement out in the trees. Not branches falling, not just wind. It was heavier, slow crunches in the wet ground. I froze in place. My breath came out in clouds of steam. The woods were dark, so dark I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the edge of my tarp. The rain masked most sounds, but there was a rhythm in between the drops, something pacing. I held the hatchet tighter, staring out into the black. The sound stopped after a while, but the silence left my nerves stretched thin. I lay back down, though I didn't close my eyes. Every now and then I thought I caught the sound again, far off and then closer, like something circling. I tried to tell myself it was only my imagination, the brain twisting the sound of rain into something else. Still, I couldn't relax. The smell of wet pine needles mixed with the smoke of the small fire I had tried to keep going, though the rain had nearly drowned it out. At some point, exhaustion got the better of me. I drifted into a shallow sleep, twitching awake at every creak or drip. When I opened my eyes again, it was still dark but quieter. The rain had eased into a drizzle. That's when I noticed it. Fresh impressions in the soft mud just a few feet from the tarp. They weren't boot prints, but they weren't animal either, at least not like deer or raccoon. Wide, smeared marks, almost like someone had slid their feet through the muck. My chest tightened as I crouched closer, trying to make sense of them. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe runoff from the rain had distorted the soil, but the truth was clear. Something had been there, moving close to where I slept. I didn't waste time. I packed my things quickly, shoving wet clothes into my bag, scattering mud on my sleeping bag as I rolled it up. I slung everything over my shoulder and grabbed my flashlight, though the batteries were weak and the beam was dim. The walk back down the old logging road was slow and tense. The drizzle had made the ground slick, and my boots slipped on the mud more than once. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone step out from the tree line. But there was nothing, just the steady drip of water from the branches above. By the time I reached the truck, my clothes were soaked through again. I threw my pack into the bed and climbed in, turning the key. The engine coughed but started. I gripped the wheel and eased down the path, tires sliding as the mud grabbed at them. I had to fight to keep it straight, the headlights cutting weak beams through the mist. When I finally reached the main road, a strip of cracked asphalt about 6 miles from the property, I pulled over and shut the engine off. I sat there for a long while, hands still wrapped around the steering wheel, listening to the ticking sound of rain cooling on the hood. My heartbeat slowed, though my mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps in the trees, the strange marks in the mud. I didn't go back to the site for a month. When I finally returned in the dry light of summer, the posts I had set were still there, but the ground had hardened over and the tracks were gone. The tarp was shredded where the wind had caught it, and most of my tools were rusting in the grass. I stood there staring at it all, the silence of the woods pressing in around me. I eventually did finish the cabin, but it took me 2 more summers, and I never stayed there at night again without a lock on the door and a rifle nearby. That rainy night in the woods stayed with me, not because of anything I saw clearly, but because of what I felt, how close something had come without showing itself. And in those moments when the rain hits the roof and the wind shifts through the trees, I still think about those prints in the mud, and I wonder what had been watching me out there. I was 23 when I decided to take a short trip outside of town, far from the noise of the city. It was late October of 1996, the kind of season where the air carried a sharp bite and the days seemed to shrink faster than I was ready for. I borrowed my uncle's pickup truck and drove west, past the old industrial areas and out into the hills of rural Kentucky. My uncle told me about a cheap cabin I could use for a weekend, a place someone in the family hadn't bothered with in years. He said it sat next to a small private graveyard that dated back to the 1800s. That part made me pause, but I told myself it was just land with stones in it, nothing more. The drive there took hours, winding roads that got narrower and rougher the deeper I went. By the time I pulled onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was already sliding low, burning red through the trees. The cabin looked worse than I expected. It was a squat one-room structure with faded planks and a sagging porch. Moss clung to the roof, and weeds pushed up through the cracks in the steps. What made the place stand out, though, was the graveyard just behind it. The headstones were crooked, most leaning as if the earth itself was swallowing them. Some stones were broken in half, some worn so smooth the names had faded. A rusted iron fence, bent and twisted in places, tried to encircle it, but there were gaps where whole sections had collapsed. The ground dipped unevenly there, mounds and depressions showing where the graves had shifted over time. I told myself it was just history, just old bones, nothing to worry about. I unloaded my bag from the truck and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of rot and dust, but it was dry at least. The single window was grimy, barely letting in the last of the light. The wooden floor creaked loudly under my boots, and cobwebs hung in thick strands from the rafters. There was an old cot against the wall, the kind with a thin wire frame that looked like it would snap if you sat down too hard. A small wood stove squatted in the corner, its pipe crooked but still connected. By the time I got a fire going, the light outside had nearly vanished. The graveyard behind the cabin disappeared into shadow, but I could still make out the outlines of stones under the rising moon. I ate a cold sandwich I'd packed, then sat on the cot, listening to the silence. The kind of silence that pressed in, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Around midnight, I woke from a shallow doze to a noise. At first I thought it was a branch hitting the cabin, but when it came again, I sat up straight. It was a metallic scraping sound, faint but steady, as if something heavy was being dragged across stone. My skin prickled. I listened hard, holding my breath, and it came again, slow, dragging metal against rock. It was coming from behind the cabin, from the direction of the graveyard. I told myself it was probably a deer or some animal moving through the old fence. Maybe it caught its antlers on the metal. That explanation held me together enough to sit back down, but I didn't sleep again. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear soft, shifting sounds outside, like weight moving across the ground. At dawn, I stepped outside. The grass was wet with dew, and the graveyard sat under a pale gray sky. I walked to the edge of the fence, trying to prove to myself I was being foolish. That's when I saw it. Several of the graves had fresh dirt disturbed on them. Not dug up entirely, but the soil was churned, scattered, like someone had stomped around in the night. The ground was uneven, as though someone had dragged something heavy over it. My stomach dropped. I looked for tracks but couldn't see clear ones. The grass was pressed in spots, but not enough to be sure of what made it. I stepped carefully, scanning the stones, and that's when I noticed one of the headstones had fresh scrapes across it. Long marks, like a metal tool had been raked hard against the stone. The sound from the night before came rushing back to me, that grinding metal noise. My first thought was that someone else had been there. Maybe kids, maybe someone with a sick sense of humor, messing around in an old graveyard. But this place was miles off the main road, hidden deep in the trees. Who would come out here in the middle of the night just to scrape stones and tear up graves? The rest of the day dragged. I tried to distract myself by gathering wood, fixing up the stove, walking down the dirt path. But every time I looked back, those crooked stones stared at me from behind the cabin, quiet and heavy. When night came again, I felt dread pool in my stomach. I lit the fire in the stove, sat with my back to the wall, and tried to keep awake. Hours passed. The woods outside stayed still. Then, sometime past midnight, it began again. That slow, dragging metal sound. This time closer. It wasn't distant in the graveyard, it was right outside the cabin wall. My heart thudded so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. I didn't move, just sat frozen, listening. The scraping stopped, then came again, moving along the side of the cabin. Something was circling me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the small flashlight from my bag, threw the door open, and shined the beam outside. The graveyard lay in silence. Nothing moved, but the ground was torn up worse than before, dark streaks running from one grave to another, as if something had been dragged across them. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat clutching the flashlight, staring at the door, waiting for daylight. When morning finally came, I made a choice. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag, loaded the truck, and took one last look at the graveyard. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl worse than anything else. Near the far edge of the fence, there was a fresh hole in the ground. Not just disturbed dirt, a full hole wide and deep, like someone had started digging up a grave. The soil was piled high to one side, and the bottom was nothing but dark earth. I didn't wait to see more. I drove off down the dirt path, the cabin and its graveyard shrinking in the mirror until they were swallowed by trees. On the way back to town, I kept trying to explain it. Maybe someone was using that graveyard at night for something, illegal digging, who knows? Maybe it was people hiding from the law, moving things under cover of darkness. Whatever the truth was, I knew one thing. I had been sitting in that cabin, alone, just yards away from someone tearing at the earth and dragging metal across stone. I never told my uncle what I saw. When he asked if I liked the place, I just said it wasn't for me. I never went back, and I never took the back roads near there again. Because the truth is simple, and it still chills me. Someone was out there in that graveyard, working at night, close enough for me to hear every scrape. And I'll never know what they were digging for, or if they finished. I never thought I would end up spending a week alone in an old cabin in the English countryside. But in the summer of 2012, I found myself doing exactly that. I was 29 then, living in Manchester, and I had just gone through a breakup. I needed to get away from the noise of the city and clear my head, so I booked a small rental cottage in Northumberland, not far from the border with Scotland. The listing had shown it as a rustic cabin, surrounded by farmland and dense woodland, with nothing but hills in the distance. The place looked quiet, maybe even too quiet, but I told myself that was exactly what I needed. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time walking the trails, reading, and trying to cook with the small wood stove. The cabin itself was simple: stone walls, timber beams, and a slate roof. Inside, there was a narrow staircase, uneven floors, and drafty windows that whistled when the wind picked up. It had a damp smell that clung to the corners no matter how much I aired the rooms out. At night, the silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the distant bleating of sheep. I wasn't used to that kind of silence. It made the smallest sounds, like the creak of the old staircase or the snapping of wood in the stove, feel louder than they should. On the fourth night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled across the hills and slammed against the windows. I was lying in bed, watching the ceiling beams shift in the dim light of the lamp, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, like footsteps on gravel, but it didn't stop. The sound moved around the side of the cabin, crunching slowly, pausing, then moving again. I thought maybe it was an animal, a fox or a deer nosing around the rubbish bins, but when I looked out the small upstairs window, I froze. At the edge of the yard, near the broken stone wall, stood a woman. She wasn't moving. She stood with her back slightly hunched, her head tilted down, her arms hanging loose at her sides. Her hair was long, dark, and plastered against her face from the rain. The way she was standing, it was almost as if she had been there a long time, not minding the storm. My first thought was that she might have been a lost hiker, someone caught out in the weather, but something about her posture set off a deep unease. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't moving toward the cabin. She was just standing there in the dark, rain pouring over her, watching, or at least facing, the cabin. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself she probably needed help, but I couldn't shake the image of how unnatural she looked just standing in the rain like that. I waited a few minutes, then forced myself to look again. The yard was empty. The stone wall was bare. She was gone. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it. I hadn't slept well. The storm had made strange shadows, and maybe my mind had played a trick on me. But when I went outside to check the bins, I noticed something that made me stop. The muddy ground near the wall was disturbed. There were clear footprints pressed into the soft earth, leading from the road to the edge of the yard. They were narrow, bare footprints. Whoever it was hadn't been wearing shoes. That detail bothered me all day. No one in their right mind would be walking barefoot through muddy fields in a storm. Still, I kept telling myself it had to be someone lost, maybe drunk, maybe confused. People wandered into strange places all the time. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I went outside, even just to bring in firewood, I felt like someone's eyes were on me from the tree line. That night, I barely slept. The rain had stopped, but the cabin creaked and shifted with every gust of wind. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps on the gravel. Slow, deliberate crunching across the yard. I lay in bed frozen, barely breathing, straining my ears. The steps stopped just outside the cabin wall, near the kitchen window. The sound of dripping water followed, as if someone was standing there soaked, shifting slightly from foot to foot. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window again. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the noise to stop. It went on for what felt like an hour before finally fading away. When daylight came, I checked outside. More footprints. Bare, narrow, pressed deep into the mud near the kitchen window. I didn't stay outside long. By then, I had started to regret coming at all. I had 3 days left on the rental, but I felt cornered. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave right away, but another part of me kept saying I was being paranoid. Maybe the cabin owner would laugh if I told him I'd seen a barefoot woman in the rain. Maybe it really was just some local who had wandered too close. On the 6th night, everything came to a head. I was sitting in the small living room with the lamp on, trying to distract myself with a book, when I caught movement in the reflection of the window. My stomach dropped. I turned and she was there, standing at the edge of the yard again, facing the cabin. Her hair hung wet and dark, and though the night was clear, her clothes looked damp. Even from that distance, I could see her head tilting slightly as if she was studying the cabin. I didn't move. I sat perfectly still, my hands gripping the armrest so hard my fingers hurt. After a few minutes, I blinked, and she was gone again. Not walking away, just gone. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright in bed until dawn, clutching the heavy flashlight I'd found in the cupboard. Every sound made me jump. By morning, I had decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag without bothering to fold. When I went outside to load the car, I forced myself not to look toward the wall. But as I opened the car door, my eyes darted across the yard anyway. There were fresh footprints. They led from the tree line to the cabin door. Bare, narrow, pressed deep into the mud, stopping only inches from where I had been sleeping inside. That was enough for me. I drove away down the narrow road, not daring to look back in the mirror until I was miles away. To this day, I don't know who she was. Maybe she was someone who lived rough in the woods, someone not in her right mind. Maybe she had been watching that cabin long before I arrived. All I know is that the sight of her, standing motionless in the rain, has never left me. I haven't rented another cabin since. When I think about it, the part that unsettles me most isn't the nights I saw her at a distance. It's knowing that at some point, while I slept, she came right up to the door. That thought alone keeps me awake sometimes, even now. I was 32 the first time I decided to spend a winter week alone in a cabin. It was in 2016, tucked in the northern woods of Minnesota, a couple of hours away from Duluth. A friend of mine had told me about the place. Cheap, isolated, and built decades ago but still sturdy. I had been looking for a break from the city, from constant noise and routine. I wanted quiet, to hunt a little, to fish if the lake wasn't frozen solid, and to just be away from people. The drive up was long, and once I left the main roads it became nothing but winding dirt paths lined with endless trees. Snow packed against the edges, my tires crunching on frozen mud. My phone had already lost signal half an hour before I arrived, and by the time I saw the cabin, I felt like I had been cut off from everything. The place stood at the edge of a clearing, one story, dark wood walls, a metal chimney poking up crooked. A shed leaned against its right side, and a woodpile was stacked half-collapsed near the porch. It looked like no one had been here for a while, but it didn't look abandoned either. Inside smelled of old pine, dust, and smoke from the last fire someone had burned there. The floor was wooden, creaking with every step, and the single bedroom held nothing but a narrow bed with a thin mattress. I unpacked quickly, just my duffel bag, some food supplies, a small hunting rifle, and a couple of books. I told myself it was going to be good. Just me, the woods, and silence. The first 2 days went by quietly. I cut wood for the stove, explored the frozen edges of the lake, and followed deer tracks through the snow. At night, the silence was thick, only broken by the pop of the fire in the stove or the groan of the cabin's beams. I slept light, waking often to shift under the heavy blanket. The cold settled into the cabin no matter how much wood I fed the stove. On the third night, something changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning. The fire had died down, the cabin dark except for the faint red glow from the stove. At first, I thought it was the cold that woke me, but then I noticed it. The sound of snow crunching outside. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. My first thought was deer, but the weight was different, heavier, human. I held my breath, listening, and the steps went on for what felt like a full minute, then stopped. I stayed still, every muscle tight. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe snow falling off a branch, maybe my mind playing tricks in the silence. I pulled the blanket back over my head and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I went outside. The snow around the cabin was marked with prints. Boots, not mine. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin twice, and then disappeared back into the woods. No car tracks, no snowmobile, just boots. I stood there in the freezing air for a long time staring at them, a heavy weight settling in my chest. Whoever it was had been close, watching. I tried to shrug it off. People lived out here after all. Maybe a neighbor, maybe someone hunting, just curious about the cabin. I spent the day splitting more wood, keeping busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked into the trees, I half expected to see someone standing there. That night, I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered with before, and set the rifle near the bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak, every groan of the cabin made me flinch. Around midnight, I heard it again. Crunch, slow steps, this time closer to the porch. Then silence. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. The stove's glow barely lit the room. I could hear the faint scrape of wood, someone touching the porch railing or the doorframe. My mouth was dry, my hands sweating even in the cold. I wanted to yell, but my throat locked up. I waited, straining to hear. After a few minutes, the noises stopped. Whoever it was, they were gone again. In the morning, I found more prints, fresh, leading up onto the porch, right to the door. I noticed scratches on the wood around the frame, like someone had run a knife or some metal along it. Not deep, but clear enough. That day, I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself it was paranoia, that if I left now, I'd feel stupid later. The cabin was remote, but not impossibly so. People crossed through these woods all the time. I forced myself to stay. The 5th night was the worst. I built the fire higher than usual and double-checked the door. I even wedged a chair under the handle. I lay in bed, rifle beside me, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it. Hours passed, and I almost started to believe it was over. Then, around 1 in the morning, the steps came back. Slow, steady, circling again. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then the handle of the door rattled. Quiet at first, then harder. The chair under it creaked. I gripped the rifle, sitting up, pointing it at the door. My hands shook so much I had to press the stock against my knee. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then scraping against the window. Long, slow scratches on the glass, just feet from where I lay. I stayed like that until dawn, barely breathing, the rifle aimed, expecting the glass to shatter. It never did. When the light came, I finally moved. Outside, the prints covered the porch. Fresh, clear. The window had smears on it, streaks where a hand had pressed against the glass. Fingers wide, adult size. That was it. I wasn't going to wait for another night. I packed my bag, threw my things in the truck, and left. The road out was rough, icy, but I didn't care. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking in the road behind me. When I finally reached the main road hours later, I stopped at a gas station. I told the clerk there was someone hanging around the cabin, but he just shrugged and said people sometimes did strange things out there. That was all. No police, no answers. I never went back. Even now, years later, I still think about it. The prints circling the cabin, the scratches on the window, the sound of boots in the snow. Someone had been there every night, watching, testing the door, waiting. I don't know what they wanted or why they never forced their way in. I only know one thing. If I had stayed another night, I don't think I would have left at all. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone at a hunting cabin in the upper woods of Montana. It was early October of 1998, the air already sharp with the kind of cold that bit through your jacket at night. A friend of a coworker had told me about a small, weathered cabin he sometimes used during hunting season. It sat about 2 miles off a dirt logging road, tucked between stretches of thick pine and an old stream that ran clear and cold down from the hills. He hadn't been there for years, and he said if I didn't mind the rough conditions, I could use it for free. I jumped at the chance. The cabin was simple, a one-room box with a sagging roofline, made of logs gone gray with age. The door stuck every time I tried to pull it shut. Inside there was a small iron stove in the corner, a bunk bed with a torn mattress, and shelves lined with rusting tins and jars. No running water, no electricity, just 4 walls, a roof, and a quietness that seemed too heavy when I first stepped inside. My plan was to hunt during the mornings and evenings and spend the afternoons fishing the stream or splitting firewood. I brought with me a cooler full of food, a rifle, a lantern, a small gas stove, and enough firewood in my truck to get me started. I thought I had prepared myself for the silence, but the quiet up there was a different thing than I'd ever felt before. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like something pressing on your chest. The first night, I lay on the old mattress with my sleeping bag pulled tight around me. The woods outside never went still. I could hear branches snapping in the dark, the far-off call of coyotes, and the shifting creaks of the cabin itself. I told myself it was just animals, just the woods settling around me. Still, my ears stayed sharp to every sound until exhaustion finally won out. On the second day, I followed the stream for a mile or so and marked spots where elk had come down to drink. I didn't see anything worth shooting, but I told myself there was time. When I came back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. The pile of wood I'd stacked near the door had shifted. It wasn't a collapse. Someone had moved pieces from one side to the other, like they'd been rearranged. I figured maybe I had just stacked it poorly the night before, and the wind or the natural settling had caused it. I brushed it off, though a part of me didn't quite believe that. That night, the noises outside felt closer. The snapping of twigs was deliberate, slow, like footsteps through dry brush. I lay awake listening, my rifle leaning against the side of the bed. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the window, all I could see were the trees, tall and black against the faint moonlight. Nothing moved, but the silence after the noise was worse than the noise itself. By the third day, I was uneasy. I carried my rifle even when I went just to fetch water from the stream. I noticed small things. My cooler had shifted a few inches inside the cabin. The door, which I swore I had latched, stood slightly open when I returned from scouting in the late afternoon. I tried to convince myself I was just being careless, but I knew I wasn't. That night, I stacked a heavy chair against the door. Sleep came in short, restless bursts. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the faintest scrape against the outside wall. It was steady, like something brushing back and forth, wood against wood or maybe metal against bark. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might wake the woods itself. I stayed still in my bag, clutching the rifle, staring at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. The noise lasted maybe a minute, then stopped. I didn't move until dawn. By then, my nerves were frayed. I told myself I would stay one more night, then head back. I spent the day checking the area around the cabin. At the edge of the treeline, maybe 30 yards out, I found boot prints in the soft dirt. They weren't mine. They were older, edges softened by a day or two, but they were human. Someone had been close, watching, maybe even circling. The prints went parallel to the tree line, then cut back into the woods. I knew then that I wasn't alone. The final night was the longest of my life. I kept the lantern burning low, the rifle across my lap, my ears straining at every sound. Around midnight, the noises began again. This time it wasn't twigs snapping or brush moving. It was the slow, unmistakable crunch of footsteps circling the cabin. Whoever it was, they were out there, close enough that I could hear the weight shift on each step. They moved slowly, almost dragging, like they wanted me to know they were there.
I sat frozen, barely brilling.
The chair against the door looked pathetic now, like it wouldn't hold for a second if someone decided to push. I thought about bolting out the back window, but the thought of stepping into those woods with someone waiting stopped me cold. The footsteps circled twice, maybe 3 times, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. My mouth was dry, my hands shaking against the rifle. Minutes dragged like hours. I don't think I blinked the entire time. At some point, exhaustion and terror mixed into a fog, and I must have dozed off with my back against the wall. When I woke, it was dawn. The lantern had burned out, and pale light crept through the cracks in the logs. I opened the door slowly, rifle raised. The clearing was empty, the woods still. But in the dirt, plain as day, were fresh prints leading right up to the cabin. They stopped just feet from the door, turned, and vanished back into the treeline. I didn't wait around. I shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could, not even caring about the things I left behind. The drive out was a blur of bouncing tires and dust clouds. I didn't breathe easy until I hit the paved road 20 miles south. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked about it again. Whoever had been out there those nights, they hadn't been passing through. They had been watching, waiting, for what, I don't know. What I do know is that the silence of those woods never felt empty. It was full of eyes. And once you hear footsteps outside your cabin in the dead of night, you never forget how close danger can come without ever saying a word. I had always told myself I would never go back there. But in the fall of 1998, I ended up driving 6 hours north into the wooded backroads of Montana. I had been 33 at the time, living in a small apartment in Billings, trying to keep work steady at the auto shop, but my mind had been restless for weeks. My uncle had passed away earlier that year, and with him gone, the little cabin he had built decades earlier sat empty. The place was buried deep in the timberline, miles from the nearest paved road, and while it had once been a weekend getaway for the family, it had long since fallen into neglect. I told myself I was going up there to clean it out, maybe board the windows, maybe see what could be salvaged. The truth was, I was curious. I hadn't been there in over 15 years, and memories of that place had been fading, replaced by fuzzy images of damp wood, mice in the walls, and the smell of smoke that never seemed to leave the place. The drive up was tiring. The roads narrowed the farther I went, and by the time I pulled off the county highway onto a dirt track that led toward the hills, the sun was already hanging low behind the tree line. The trail had deep ruts from snowmelt that my pickup barely managed, and the branches clawed at the sides of the truck as I forced it through. When I finally spotted the cabin, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The roof sagged on one side, shingles missing, and the porch leaned at an angle. The windows were streaked with dirt, and the front door had a split running through it. I stepped out, the air colder than I expected, damp with the smell of pine and wet earth. The forest pressed in tight, the tall trees bending slightly in the evening wind. Inside, it was worse than I remembered. Dust covered everything, the air stale and sharp with the smell of rot. A broken chair lay collapsed in the corner, and the table was warped from moisture. The old wood stove sat rusting, its door hanging open. I moved slowly, careful not to step on the loose boards, brushing cobwebs from my face. I checked each room, the small bedroom in back, the closet with cracked shelves, and the bathroom that was nothing more than a pipe sink and a toilet barely attached to the floor. I decided I would spend the night. It wasn't part of the plan, but driving back in the dark on that trail felt impossible. I brought in my pack from the truck, set up a lantern, and laid my sleeping bag out on the floor. When darkness fell, it fell hard. Out there, no streetlights, no glow from town, just blackness. I could hear the forest outside, branches creaking, leaves whispering, and every now and then something heavier moving through the brush. I tried to tell myself it was deer, maybe an elk, but the sounds carried too close, too deliberate. I tried to sleep, but the silence inside the cabin made every sound outside seem magnified. The wood of the walls creaked, the wind whistled through cracks, and at one point I swore I heard footsteps on the porch. My chest tightened, and I sat up in the sleeping bag, staring toward the door. I held still for minutes, listening. Nothing followed, only the soft scrape of branches against the roof. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, the lantern had burned down low. The air had turned icy. Then I heard it again, this time clearer, the crunch of gravel just outside. I knew that sound. The path to the cabin was lined with it. I froze. My heart hammered, and I reached for the flashlight by my side. I flicked it on, sweeping it across the room, then toward the door. The sound stopped. I sat there with the flashlight trained on the door until my arm ached. No knock, no voice, nothing. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself maybe it had been an animal again, something brushing across the ground. Still, I couldn't bring myself to turn the light off. Morning finally came, pale gray light slipping through the dirty windows. I stepped outside stiff and exhausted. The ground was damp with dew, and I walked around the cabin, scanning for prints. That's when I saw them. Human tracks, clear, pressed into the soft dirt near the gravel path. They weren't mine. These came from the woods and stopped near the porch steps. Then they turned back. My stomach dropped. The thought of someone out there, watching while I slept, was worse than anything I had imagined. I checked my truck. Still locked, still there. I loaded my bag and tools quickly, but for some reason I didn't leave right away. Instead, I walked a little way down the path, following where the footprints led. They disappeared into the thicker brush. The woods felt wrong, too quiet.
No birds, no rustling.
Just stillness. I turned back fast, uneasy, and packed the last of my things. By noon, I was driving out, every bump in the road rattling through me. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my hands shake on the wheel. Another truck. A dark, older model pickup was pulled just off the trail near where the dirt met the main road. Its windows were tinted, and I couldn't see if anyone was inside. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I kept driving until the highway opened in front of me and the forest fell away behind. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back. The cabin still stands, I'm sure, maybe more collapsed now, maybe swallowed by the trees. But I know someone else had been there that night. Someone walked up to that porch, stood there listening, maybe even watching through the cracks in the windows. And whoever it was drove an old truck and didn't want me to see them. The cabin wasn't haunted. It didn't need to be. The real fear was knowing I wasn't alone in the middle of nowhere, and that whoever was out there had chosen to come close, then vanish back into the woods without a trace. That was enough to keep me away for the rest of my life. I hadn't planned on going back near his cabin, not after everything that had happened, but the road I took that afternoon curved right by it. It was late October, the kind of day where the air already felt like winter was creeping in, sharp and dry, carrying that smell of old leaves and cold earth. I had been driving north from town, just killing time really, with no real reason except to get away from everything. The cabin sat about 4 miles down a narrow dirt road off Route 17, tucked between old pine trees and a few bare oaks that rattled in the wind. I hadn't been out that way in years. My ex-husband, Daniel, had built that place when we were still together. He was good with his hands, liked to do everything himself, and he poured his weekends into it. We stayed there some summers, but it had been more his dream than mine. After the divorce, he stayed out there most of the time until he passed away last year. The coroner said it was a heart attack. He was only 52. As I slowed down near the turnoff, I thought about just driving past, keeping my eyes straight ahead, but something pulled at me. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was just that strange quiet stretch of woods that made me want to see if the place still looked the same. The dirt road was rough, with weeds pushing through the gravel. Branches leaned over it like they were trying to block the way. My tires crunched slow as I drove in, the sound loud in the still air. I pulled up near the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged a little on the left side. The windows were dark, smeared with dust and spider webs. The porch boards were gray and bent, and the front door hung slightly crooked. A few empty beer bottles lay in the grass near the steps, and I wondered if kids had been sneaking out here. I turned off the car but kept the keys in my hand. The air was colder than it should have been for that time of day. I stood there for a long minute before I made myself walk up the path. Every step crunched over damp leaves, and I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no whine through the trees, nothing but the faint tick of my car engine cooling down behind me. The porch creaked under my weight. I touched the door without meaning to, and it gave under my hand. It wasn't locked. Inside, the smell hit me first. Mildew, old wood, and something sour that made my stomach tighten. The cabin looked frozen in time, like no one had touched it since the day he died. There was still a chair near the wood stove, the same one he used to sit in with a beer after working all day. The table was covered with dust, but there were plates and silverware still out, like he had left them after one meal and never bothered to put them away. On the counter, a few empty cans of soup stood in a row, all the labels faded. The place gave me an uneasy feeling, not because I thought anything was in there with me, but because of the weight of it, the way someone's life could shrink down to a few objects left behind in a cabin nobody wanted. I walked through the rooms, each one darker than the last. The bedroom door stuck when I tried to open it, but it finally gave. Inside, the bed was unmade, sheets twisted like he had gotten up in a hurry. There were clothes in a heap on the floor, his boots near the corner, the laces undone. I noticed the window was cracked, a thin line running through the glass. Cold air seeped in. I looked closer and saw marks along the frame, like someone had tried to pry it open with something metal. My throat tightened. It wasn't the kind of thing Daniel would have left. He always fixed things right away, never let anything stay broken. I backed out and went toward the small storage room he had built at the back. The door there was shut tight, I had to push hard to get it open, and when it swung in, I froze. Inside, there were boxes stacked against the walls. Most were collapsed with damp, but a few still stood upright. In the middle, on the concrete floor, there were cigarette butts scattered in a pile. Fresh, not old. Some still had that faint smell of tobacco. Next to them was a half-empty plastic water bottle, the kind you buy at a gas station. The label was new. That's when it sank in. Someone had been staying here. Not months ago, not years ago, but recently. The back of my neck prickled as I listened. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the sound of my heart pounding hard in my chest. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make noise. The floorboards groaned under me, and for a second I swore I heard something shift from the other side of the wall. A soft scrape like a shoe against wood. I didn't wait to find out. I moved as quiet as I could, but once I hit the front door, I broke into a full stride down the porch steps. The clearing felt too open, like eyes were on me from the trees. I fumbled the car keys, dropped them, cursed under my breath, then snatched them up fast. When I got in the car, I locked the doors before even starting the engine. My hands shook on the wheel as I turned the key. The headlights cut across the cabin, and in that beam of light, I saw it. The curtain in the front window shifted slightly, like someone had just let it fall back into place. I hit the gas hard, spinning gravel as I tore down that dirt road. My eyes flicked to the mirror again and again, half expecting to see someone running after me, but there was nothing. Just the trees swallowing up the cabin as I put distance between us. By the time I reached the highway, my breathing finally slowed, though my chest still felt tight. I didn't stop until I was back in town, parked in front of the diner with neon lights buzzing above. I sat there, staring at the road ahead, knowing exactly what I had seen and what it meant. That cabin wasn't empty. Someone was living in there, someone who didn't want me to know. And as much as part of me wanted to pretend it didn't matter, I couldn't shake the thought that Daniel's death out there might not have been as simple as a heart attack. I never went back again, but every time I drive down Route 17 and past that turnoff, I feel it. The weight of those woods, the darkness behind that window, and the certainty that there's still someone inside watching.